Mankind has long sought the answers to eternal questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What do we mean by good and evil? Over 2,500 years ago in the West, men such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates struggled with these problems. Indeed, it was the Greeks who coined the word for this search, philosophy. The search was not confined to the West. Philosophy thrived in the Middle East, in India, in China, and Japan. Our journey begins in the Chinese province of Shantung. A man who reviews the old so as to find out the new is qualified to teach others. Confucius, known in the West as Confucius, was born in what was then the state of Lu in about 551 BC. His family seemed to have been from the Chinese class known as Jinzi, which means son of a ruler. There is no proof, though, that he was of royal blood.
According to records, his father was a warrior, but I guess it would be quite a low social rank in the state. And his father married his mother when she was 16 years old. But when Confucius was 3 years old, his father died. So this is why Confucius said, when he was young, his family was poor.
Confucius appears to have been brought up in a loving family. Indeed, the family, and the love and respect shared amongst its members, was to become central to Confucian philosophy. As he grew to manhood, Confucius entered government service. It was a popular choice for a young man of his class. His first job was an overseer of fields. It was a responsible job in a society where agriculture was vital to the economy. By the time he was 21, Confucius was chief overseer to a nobleman named Qi. But just when his career was about to prosper, tragedy struck. The aunt who had raised him died. Confucius retired from public life to mourn her.
Mourning was not for Confucius simply an expression of private grief that someone close to you had died. He regarded filial piety, what he called xiao, in other words, respect for your parents, as one of the very important pillars of the way in which society was set up. For that reason, official mourning could last for a very long period in ancient China, perhaps as long as 3 years, and this meant that you often had to withdraw from many public duties and dress in particular ways throughout the whole of that period to show that you were fulfilling the proper mourning rites.
There was quite a few debates around these issues. Some of his disciples said that the 3 years were too long because this would be costly and not economic. So Confucius said, your parents, when you were born, your parents cherished you for 3 years. But when they died, you even not give 3 years mourning to them. So how this unhuman and you are. He criticized his student.
Confucius used the period of mourning to ponder his future. He was too blunt and honest to be a politician or a high-grade civil servant. Confucius' answer was a stroke of genius. China had no schools. He would found one and become its first teacher.
He set up this private school and who admitted the students not only from this noble background, but also from the commoners. And also he admitted students whether or not they were rich or poor. And he strongly propagated an idea that in education there should be no class. So that is a very valuable thing, and to China, to Chinese education. And also because this for poor people, and so he would lower down his fees to as low as but 3 dried meat. So anyone, if he is willing to study, and if he could present 3 pieces of dried meat, then he would become a student of his school.
Pupils paid him according to their means. Those who lived too far from the school to travel lived in Confucius' home. His first pupils were young men of about his own age. They were civil servants like him. But what was he to teach? He wanted the education his pupils received to be both practical and moral. They would learn why and how their future actions and decisions would bring benefits to the people they served. Confucius expected his pupils to be familiar with certain Chinese texts.
The education at that time normally have 6 the subjects. These rights, history, poetry, music, math, and this archery. But how the math and archery were taught, we don't know. We don't have much knowledge about this.
Confucius' teaching methods paralleled those of Socrates in the West. Conversation between teachers and pupils, often on a one-to-one basis. Confucius would often give different answers to the same question. One day, a student asked him if he should put his newly acquired knowledge immediately into practice. No, I think you should first discuss what you have learned with your father and your elder brothers. Later the same day, another student asked him the same question. Yes, you should immediately put what you have learnt into practice. To consult with anyone else would only be wasting time. A third student queried these conflicting answers. Confucius explained that the first student was hot-headed and needed to be held back. The second student was shy and needed to be pushed forward. If students disagreed with him, Confucius encouraged them to argue their case. The relationship was more like that between father and son than between teacher and pupil. Confucius never felt that criticism and punishment were effective motivators. Nevertheless, he expected his students to work hard. His methods inspired loyalty and affection. Even his most troublesome pupil, Josiah, came to regard him as the greatest man who ever lived. Within a few short years, the reputation of the school and of Confucius spread throughout China. The first concept of his philosophy was Ren, goodness or virtue.
Ren is central to Confucius and the philosophy or this religious doctrine. There is no agreement and in what, if we can use this single definition, what Ren is. But from my personal view, and I would think that Zen contains 2 dimensions. One, we could say Zen is a virtue, or is the most important virtue. And in this case, probably we could translate Zen as the humanity and benevolence and kindness or goodness. So this that is and we take this. Confucius understands this Zen as a virtue is essential to being human. So if you want to be fully human, you must possess this virtue.
Ren manifested itself in the way a person lived his life, being sympathetic to the sufferings of others. It is only a man of Ren who knows how to love people and how to hate people. How should a man cultivate Ren? To achieve Ren, one must begin by loving others. This is a philosophical precept common to all major religions. Confucius listed 5 virtues: respect, magnanimity, sincerity, diligence, and kindness.
By these 5 virtues, he said, if a person who could practice these 5 virtues, then he would have no fault, and he would, and totally transform his own character.
However, there was a flip side to this. It often meant that there were situations where you felt that to be virtuous, you would actually have to contradict your ruler, to speak out against some evil act, and this could often make your own position very awkward. This proved to be a problem for Confucius himself. One of the reasons he often did not get sufficient promotion in the civil service system in ancient China was that he kept telling unwelcome truths to the rulers who didn't wish to hear that they were acting wrongly. But on the other hand, he would argue that if you wish to follow the path of virtue correctly, then a true scholar, a true gentleman, had no alternative but to point these transgressions out.
Confucius illustrated the meaning of Ren by drawing a distinction between 2 different types of men. The first type was called a Ren, a low, evil person. The second type was called Jinse, the man of virtue. Confucius set out the 9 factors that should guide the conduct of the Jinse. When he sees clearly and distinctly without prejudice. When he listens, he hears everything that is said without twisting the speaker's words. When he looks at this world, his face is kind and sympathetic. When you observe his manners, you see that he is always respectful. When he speaks, he is serious. When he is in doubt, he asks questions. When he is angry, he considers the consequences before he acts. When he sees the chance for gain, he always considers the right and wrong of his actions. In contrast to the Jinse, the Ren is arrogant, lacking dignity and materialistic. Confucius didn't expect the Jinse to be a saint. He should merely do his best in everyday situations. In this way, he merited honor. Confucius certainly excluded most government servants of his day from this category. For Confucius, education meant gathering knowledge, not only about the world, but also about oneself. When he looks into himself and his conduct, and he finds nothing to be ashamed of, what is there for him to be anxious about? Confucius' third concept was Tao, or the way. In Chinese, the word simply means path. For Confucius, it meant the way a person traveled through life. Were his actions selfish, or for the benefit of all? To know Tao is not as good as to love it. To love it is not as good as to practice it. To practice it, though, is difficult. Life's tasks are never finished. To Confucius, this was not a problem. It was the work itself that was important, not its completion. He conceded that few managed to live the perfect life. There are sprouting crops which never come to ear. There are others which, having come to ear, never ripen into grain. The same is true with man as it is with corn. One of the problems is that each man's task is different. There is no Tao that is right for everyone. Each man's path will be determined by his interests and abilities. What is important is that each man pursue his own way with virtue and be honest to himself. A man must cultivate a sense of moderation. This will prevent him from acting rashly.
Moderation certainly is one of very important virtues for Confucius. And on many occasions, Confucius demonstrated a very moderate attitude towards himself, because it's quite a few people compared him to be a sun, the moon, or the sage, or the person of virtue, the man of virtue. And Confucius never disagreed this easily. And he always said, he's the man, and without innate knowledge. But he studied very, very hard, and he took the ancient sages as his model, and he studied them. He pursued the way of them. So that is he became the teacher. Why he became a teacher? For the Confucius, why this moderation is so important? Because he believed moderation is one of the key qualities for a gentleman, for a 君子. And without this, a person would not be called a 君子 or gentleman.
Over the years, Confucius School prospered. Lessons were often held in local parks. Many of its students went on to attain high-ranking posts within the government. During this time, the arts were blossoming in China. The aristocracy constructed vast and expensive palaces and gardens. The theatre too flourished. Actors, dancers, and musicians were all well paid and highly respected. Because war was an ever-present threat, young men were encouraged to practice archery. Competitions were held. They were team events, so if one member of the team performed badly, he could do so without losing face. This was, and still is, important to the Chinese. Confucius encouraged his students to participate in these competitions. He believed the body to be just as important as the mind. Banquets were also popular amongst the Chinese, and we know that Confucius and his students enjoyed feasting, drinking, and music. There was nothing ascetic about Confucius' philosophy. Following the Tao didn't mean a man had to renounce the pleasures of this life.
And Confucius said, the enjoyment not just only come from this dance, singing, and music, but also come from your personal and belief and personal virtues. If a virtuous person, even in a very, very difficult situation, and say without enough food to eat, without proper clothes to wear, even that is the situation, he would still feel happy and joyful.
Confucius was undoubtedly proud of his students' success, but he often yearned to return to government service himself. Rulers often sought Confucius' advice, but were reluctant to employ him. His advice could be unpopular. Put the happiness of the people over the happiness of yourself.
Confucius found that his most noble asset, in a sense, the conviction that he had to tell the truth about what was going on in any particular state, regardless of the consequences for his own career, also held him back in his longest-held, deepest desire to become an official. He was always well respected, it appeared. On the other hand, rulers would often prefer to have someone more compliant and less trouble actually serving them at court, rather than someone who continuously was telling them that they had to rethink their own personal behavior, as well as the way in which they were running the state.
Confucius was once asked why he wasn't in government. Every citizen who acts properly with dignity, knowledge, and honor is truly in government. Sometime when he was in his 50s, Confucius was given a government post in his home state of Lu as a member of the Council of State.
Confucius was given a number of these government posts in his political career, about 4.5 years. And the first post he was appointed was this magistrate of a town. And when he was 50 or 51 years old. And it was said, and in 1 year, he managed this town very well. So this town became a model city, and for the rest of the whole country. So because he was so successful, he was promoted to be the Minister of the Public Works. In this position, and Confucius was in charge of the public works, like this agricultural and these matters, and public this road building and other matters. And then he was given another important job, this the Minister of Justice. So as the Minister of Justice, he would preside the court, and like our super judge and today's term. And he would judge the cases, important cases himself. And it said that he was very, very successful in this case because he dealing with these different cases and quick and correct.
Confucius believed he could have great influence. He would turn Lu into the perfect state, a model for the rest of China. From the writings of Confucius and his students, known as the Lun Yu, or the Analects, we can see why the philosopher was not always popular with his political masters. Confucius was once asked to name the essentials of a good government. The three most important things are enough food, enough arms, and the confidence of all the people. His master asked him which of the three he would give up if forced to do so: the arms, the bows and arrows, and war chariots. His master pressed him further. Which of the other two would he give up? The food. After all, for as long as we have known, death has come to every man. But a government without the confidence of the people is lost. At some stage in his life, Confucius had married and had a son. As well as his work at court, Confucius spent as much time as he could with his son and grandchildren. He also continued to teach. In government, the problems were the same as before. The ruler of Lu followed Confucius' advice only when it suited him. By now, Confucius was an old man. His mind must have been turning towards death. But what do we know of Confucius' religious beliefs?
Famously, once when Confucius was asked by one of his disciples about what he thought about the spirit world, Confucius answered, "There's enough going on here on earth, don't worry about the spirits." Some people, I think wrongly, have interpreted this as meaning that Confucius didn't believe in the spirit world, and this is why people have sometimes claimed that Confucianism is simply a philosophy without any religious underpinnings. What seems a more likely interpretation of Confucius' statement, though, is that he did believe, as was traditional in ancient China, in a very powerful spirit world. It's just that it was not the business of people on earth to try and poke too far into the world that they would find out more about after they had passed away and died. He believed, therefore, that there was a strong religious element, I think, in everyday human life, but that people shouldn't seek to delve too far into the mysteries of it.
On another occasion, another student asked how to understand death and how to serve the spirits. Confucius replied, if you cannot understand life, how can you understand death? If you cannot serve humans, how can you serve spirits? So this is, I think, is quite a characteristic of Confucius' thinking. So, and if the spiritual world and the human world, they are related, and all this interacted. So if you can't live your life properly now, you can't understand, can't this, do this and sacrifice to the spirits properly.
Confucius continued to serve in the government and watched with pride as his ex-students put his philosophy into practice throughout China. Confucius died in 479 BC. Many of his former students came to his funeral. Some even stayed behind to observe the 3-year period of mourning near to his grave. The devotion he inspired was summed up by one of his students, Yoro. From the birth of mankind until now, there has never been a man equal to Confucius. Mencius, known as Mencius, was born a century after Confucius' death. It was he who ensured that Confucius' teachings would not be lost to future generations.
In the century after Confucius' death, no one scholar took on board all his beliefs and made them an organized and unified belief system. Instead, various competing schools took aspects of what he had said, for instance about filial devotion or about loyalty to the ruler, and made that the aspect of some rather more specific philosophies. One of the good effects of this, though, was that there were various contending philosophies which argued points with each other and made the intellectual climate in China during that time very rich.
At school, Mencius had his first encounter with Confucianism. He was at once inspired to carry on the Confucian tradition. "What I want most to do is to study how I can best be like Confucius. Unlike Confucius, Mencius enjoyed lecturing to large audiences. He was noted for his sharp wit when dealing with others. He was also fond of luxury and material comforts. But both men shared a love of learning and valued honesty and directness. Having absorbed Confucius' ideals, Mencius set about putting them into practice. Like his hero, he traveled around China, giving advice to the various state rulers.
Although Mencius is regarded as the second greatest sage of Confucian thought after only Confucius himself, the two were very different in personality. Confucius was always a bit downtrodden in his life. He never quite got to what he really aspired, which was to serve as an official at court. Mencius, by contrast, was a rather different sort of character. He was in some ways similar to a public intellectual today whose main job was actually travelling around with a very luxurious entourage and giving advice to rulers. You might call him a sort of philosophical consultant to various rulers in kingdoms around China. To that extent, he probably wouldn't have wanted an official post because it would have tied him down and possibly even reduced his lifestyle from what he was able to do in his travelling teacher role.
On one occasion in the state of Lang, he gained an audience with King Hui. The king asked him what he had to say that would be of profit to him. "What makes your majesty think he must speak about profit?" "On the contrary, I have come to offer you some advice about virtue and humanity that has nothing to do with your idea of profit." Another time, a ruler asked him why the Jie and Zhou empires had fallen. "Because they lost the hearts of the people." Mencius was concerned that Confucius' teachings were being twisted. One area of disagreement was over the nature of man. Mencius and Confucius were in agreement. Deep at heart, all men are sympathetic to others.
Mencius's driving philosophy led him to argue that because human beings were basically good, they could be regulated in such a way that they would not have to be heavily controlled by the state if the state carried out the right policies. There was at least one other philosopher, Shinto, who followed in the Confucian tradition, but was in some ways far more pessimistic about human nature. He believed that unless the state was very strong, then human nature would make people more inclined to follow their own interests rather than the good of society as a whole. For that reason, sometimes Mencius has been characterized as the left-wing aspect of Confucian philosophy and Xunzi as the right-wing aspect. Also worth noting is another philosopher, Han Feizi, who is the founder of what's known as legalist thought. He went even further than Xunzi and rejected the ideas of Confucianism, arguing that the state itself was the most important thing, and to some extent, individual desires and individual rights really didn't matter as long as the state kept itself strong and able to resist outside attack. For that reason, his philosophy has often been regarded by Confucians as cynical and in some way damaging to greater public welfare and morals.
Mencius died in 289 BC at the age of 84. By then, he had ensured the continuing influence of Confucianism in China. He is still known there as the second stage.
It's not an exaggeration to say that in the same way that perhaps Judeo-Christian thought, as well as the thought of ancient Greece, underlines the whole intellectual and cultural legacy of the West, similarly Confucius and also his followers such as Mencius have really shaped the 2,000 plus years of Chinese history since they lived. Their beliefs, first of all, in ethics as the most important means of organizing a state, but also the importance of hierarchy and setting things in the right order to ensure social stability, have been very much the driving arguments behind every Chinese imperial dynasty. Even in the 20th century, when the imperial dynasty had fallen and the republic and then the communists took over, the new thinkers who came along, such as Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, even though they regarded themselves correctly as very much aspects of the modern side of China, were still very heavily shaped by the Confucian beliefs that they had taken on board at school when they were younger. And you can see this perhaps in the way in which they set themselves up as rulers in China when they eventually got to power.
Shinto, unlike most major religions, has no known founder. Its roots lie deep in Japanese history.
Shinto is very much the religion of prehistoric Japan. It's based in ideas that come from the period before we have recorded history. So, for instance, it's very much connected with nature worship and also the belief in the traditional souls of the ancient Japanese. In addition, it's very much connected with ideas of avoiding ritual pollution, and therefore washing in water becomes a very regular part of Shinto ceremonies from the most ancient times up to the present days. In effect, also one of the additional beliefs in it is the idea of shamanism. In other words, the idea that a particular holy person can take on board the spirit of a particular god or deity, and that spirit will speak through their mouths. And that shamanistic tradition has remained very much part of Shinto, again, into the present day.
Shinto is the way of the gods. These deities, or kami, oversee the whole of human life. They are infinite in number and may include spirits and family ancestors, as well as gods and goddesses.
As with most of the major religions of East Asia, Shinto regards the ancestors of its worshippers as a very important part of its belief system. It's believed that if one has ancestors who are treated well and given proper respect after they're dead, then in the other world they will look after you and look out for your interests. Ancestors which are not treated well, which may be neglected, can often come back as vengeful spirits which may cause you and your family harm. Therefore, it's very important to keep reverence for your ancestors as part of your religious belief system in Shinto.
The chief deity is the sun goddess, Amaterasu. Her name means she who makes the heavens shine. Her great shrine at Ise is the most sacred in Japan. Every 20 years, the Ise Jinja, as it is known, is torn down and rebuilt. The same families have been responsible for this act of renewal for the past 13 centuries.
The tearing down and rebuilding of shrines is a custom known as Shikinin Sengu in Japanese, and it takes place most notably every 20 years at the Great Shrine at Ise. The reason for this is that as far back as the 7th century AD, the Emperor Tenmu declared that it was important to make sure that the home for the gods at the shrine was kept fresh and unpolluted. In effect, the important thing is not the building, but the location of the shrine.
According to an ancient myth, there was a divine being named Izanagi no Mikoto, whose name means the august male. He descended to earth and married his sister, Izanami no Mikoto, the august female. Their union produced the islands that make up the Japanese archipelago and several deities. Izanami died from burns whilst giving birth to the fire god. Izanagi failed to bring her back from the land of the dead and purified himself by bathing in a sacred river. As he wiped the water from his left eye, Amaterasu was born. From his right eye came the moon god Tsukiyoni.
You could, broadly speaking, divide the deities or kami in Shinto into two categories, the deities of heaven and the deities of earth. Amongst the most notable, apart from Amaterasu, are some of the ancient heroes of Japanese mythology. One of those is Susanoo, who famously at the Hi River slew an 8-headed dragon. Also notable are other gods who deal with good qualities such as learning, education, and also the harvests, which of course were an important part of the agricultural economy of ancient Japan.
Sometimes mortals may be elevated to the ranks of the kami.
Generally, human beings who are turned into gods in Shinto are originally heroes or sometimes heroines who have carried out great deeds. As a result of this, there would often be some kind of memorial put up to them, which would, as time went on, slowly see them rising to divine status. On rare occasions, you would actually find that a living being was created a god during his lifetime, and that would in fact happen generally to the Japanese emperor. But in other cases, it's generally someone who is known either for great skill in warfare, for learning, or for other meritorious qualities which would allow them slowly to be changed into gods. One example is the god of learning, Tenjin, who was originally a scholar of the 9th century AD and now has, over the centuries, been transmuted into god form.
Alongside the good deities are the demons. These oni are mostly invisible. Others are animal spirits that can possess humans. They live both on Earth and in a subterranean hell called Jigoku. In Shinto, there is no clear division between good and evil. All matter is thought to possess rough and gentle characteristics, so oni are rather ambivalent characters. For instance, Inari is the benevolent god of the rice harvest, but his messenger is the fox spirit, one of the most malicious of the oni.
It's important to understand that many of the gods who emerged in Shinto originally came from the agricultural communities that primitive Japan started with, and the god of the harvest, for instance, Inari, is part of that pantheon. As a result of that, the animal spirits are often the animals who would have been seen as part of Japan's wildlife during that period, and the fox in particular, who is the messenger of Inari, is regarded as a very ambivalent sort of figure. He's often felt to, in fact, not necessarily be male, but female, and to symbolize the female force in life as opposed to the male force, and particularly female sexuality. While female sexuality, like male sexuality, is not necessarily regarded as either good or bad, it can clearly be regarded in traditional mythology as a rather slippery area where one has to watch one's feet if one's not going to be tripped up. And that kind of playfulness is often the difficulty in knowing whether a fox spirit means you good or ill in traditional mythology.
We have already mentioned the magnificent shrine dedicated to Amaterasu at Ise. Such shrines, or jinja, dedicated to various kami, are scattered across Japan. Many natural features, such as Mount Fuji, are also considered to be sacred. To climb it is seen as an act of worship. The jinja serve as the focus of many rituals.
The important thing about shrines is that they are a sacred location, which may or may not have a building on them. In the earliest times, the so-called shrines would in fact perhaps have just been a small pile of rocks at a particularly sacred place. The main purpose of the ceremonies that take place at these shrines are to remove ritual impurity or pollution. That's the basic principle at the base of Shinto. The kind of ceremonies that you would see traditionally at these shrines might be of three main types. One that is notable is where small paper streamers may be waved over something that is ritually impure by the priest to purify it. In another case, people may be enjoined to avoid particular words that may cause some form of ritual pollution. And the other very important way in which pollution can be removed at a shrine is via what's called lustration, in other words, ritual washing in water, which remains a very important part of Shinto's ceremonies today.
The earliest jinja were simple outdoor altars. Structures were later built around them. At the end of the 5th century, Buddhism was introduced into Japan.
At first, there was a bit of a consumer competition between Buddhism and Shinto in the early years of its introduction into Japan. And perhaps for the best part of several centuries, Buddhism, because it was very colourful, it had a lot of public ceremonies, and was a very public kind of religion, found itself perhaps overwhelming the more personalised and retiring ceremonies of Shinto. However, Shinto never actually faded away. It was still very much there as part of the Japanese folk religions. And one of the things that you see during the hundreds of years after the 5th century is the mixing of Buddhist and Shinto traditions. So, for instance, one of the reasons why Shinto becomes much more ritualized and formalized is that it was trying to fight back against the much more formal traditions of Buddhism and find a place for itself in what you might call the religious market of the time.
Modern jinja come in many shapes and sizes. Small ones stand on the rooftops of high-rise buildings, whilst the Meiji Jingu in Tokyo is a vast complex. Wherever possible, they stand amid trees and gardens. The worshipper passes through the torii, the threshold separating the secular world from that of the gods. Torn strips of paper, called gohei, symbolize the presence of the kami. The next stage is ritual purification of the hands and mouth with water. The shrine is made up of two elements. There is the sanctuary, or honden, which holds the image of the kami. Entry to this is normally restricted to the priests. The other element is the oratory, or haiden.
In the oratory, or haiden, the public part of the shrine, the regular Shinto ceremonies would take place. From the point of view of an ordinary worshipper, what this would mean is that you would walk in through the gate. You might first of all purify yourself by washing your hands using a traditional wooden ladle, and then you might next sacrifice a coin as a symbol of sacrifice to the spirits of the temple. You would then go forward and make the ritual bows, which consist quite often of bowing forward twice, and then clapping once, and then bowing once. You would then go on to the ceremony itself, in which the priests would take part, in which you would be ritually purified, often using sake, traditional Japanese wine, and then after that the ceremonies would continue more informally at the end of the ceremony.
The priests receive payment from groups of worshippers who manage each local shrine. There are two ranks of priests: head priests, or guchi, and kanushi.
The priest has duties which in some ways are similar to the duties of a parish priest, you might say, in the Christian tradition of the West. So for instance, when people are suffering misfortunes, they might expect the priest to carry out ceremonies which will help restore their good fortune. There's a well-known case in the early 1970s of a building in Japan where far too many people were committing suicide from the top, and a priest was basically brought in to carry out a ceremony which would stop the spirits, as it was thought, from encouraging people to commit these sorts of acts. More generally, there are also particular ages in people's lives which Shinto considers to be ritually unlucky: the age of 33 for women and 42 for men. And during those years of age, people may be in particular concerned to be in contact with their priests to make sure they take part in the correct rituals to ensure continued good luck.
Shinto worship is a very personal matter. One exception is the Matsuri, or shrine festival.
At the festival, the main business at hand is making invocations to the gods. So you would make those invocations, set up offerings to them, and then finally, when the offerings had been accepted by them, the participants in the ceremony would then be able to take part in a ceremonial feast. So the offerings may consist of things like sake, traditional Japanese wine, also fish cakes, rice cakes, and other food offerings to be thankful for the harvest, for instance. In addition, many of the things that we think of as traditional Japanese art forms, for instance traditional No theatre, in fact started as part of the religious ceremonies at the shrines and still continue today to have a very strong religious influence on their development.
The planting and harvesting of the rice are also important causes for celebration.
Rice has always traditionally been a very important part of the Japanese diet from the early days, and therefore it's always been important to give thanks to the spirits who have ensured a successful harvest. To show the importance of the rice harvest, the imperial family will generally make a very public show of being, first of all, the first family to plant rice seedlings, and then to be the first publicly to accept the harvest. This then gives a cue for celebrations of the rice festival all around Japan, which would take place in public ceremonies at shrines nationally.
Shinto priests officiate at weddings, although these are held at hotels or wedding palaces rather than in jinja. Japanese funerals, though, are usually conducted by Buddhist priests. This is because Buddhism is thought to bear the soul into the next life. There are many Shinto-based sects in Japan. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Tenrikyo.
Tenrikyo is one of the best known and most popular sects that is based on Shinto beliefs, although in some ways it's very unusual. It was founded in the 19th century, in 1838, by a woman, rather unusually, a Buddhist nun named Nakayama Miki. She was known to have seen various trances that gave her the vision of what she called a personal god. And this is one of the unusual things in Tenrikyo, that it's almost monotheistic, almost in the Western sense, which is unusual in the Shinto tradition. It also has a very strong social element. Tenrikyo believes it's very important to do public service and make sure that things like public welfare are looked after as part of your religious beliefs. In addition, it's also a very personal faith. It's not hard to pick up, and its teachings are easy to absorb. This explains the fact that today in Japan, perhaps some 2 million people are followers of Tenrikyo, and it's a very well-known religious and public institution in Japan.
The Second World War had a profound effect on Shinto, which had been the state religion since 1871. In 1945, Emperor Hirohito formally renounced all claims to divinity, and the state no longer has any involvement in religious affairs.
After 1945, when the Americans occupied Japan in the wake of the Second World War, one of the important changes they made was to democratize Japan by imposing a new constitution on it, and also making a public declaration that the emperor could no longer be considered to be a god. This in some way removed the divine status of the emperor in Japanese society, but Japan still remains a profoundly religious society in many ways. Unlike most Western societies, however, the traditional elements of Japanese religion, Buddhism, Shinto, and also in later years Christianity, still exist together very much in people's lives, and therefore on regular occasions around the year you will find that the Shinto shrines are packed with worshippers still taking part in their religious ceremonies. The fact that the emperor is no longer regarded as a god has not been any kind of major bar in the continuing development of religious belief in Japan.
Despite all this, Shinto continues to flourish and to coexist peacefully alongside Buddhism. Amid the affluence and bustle of modern Japan, people still turn for help to the kami.